My name is Carmella Pardo. I was born in Bombay, India in 1941, August.
Okay. So to start with, why don't you tell me about your parents, your family background, and their stories?
Okay. I was born actually in India because in the Second World War, the Iraqis signed a pact with the Nazis. And my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who had a brother in India, knew that there would be trouble, so he shipped his whole family to India. And so I was born there, and they returned after the war. To Iraq, I was 2 years old when we returned. Both my parents are from Basra. My father's name is Somech. My mother's name is Ani. They're both actually very well-known families, each one in a different way. The Somech family was known more intellectually. They had a famous rabbi, Chacham Abdallah Somech. My mother's family known more for being well-known merchants.
How did your parents meet each other?
The two grandmothers knew each other, and my maternal grandmother loved my paternal grandmother and decided that one of her daughters had to marry my father. But her oldest daughter was already engaged, and my mother, even though she was 15 years younger than my father, she decided that was it. She had to marry him, and my mother didn't want to. She loved somebody else, and she cried. She locked herself in the closet. She was 17 years old, but it didn't help. She married him.
Okay, can you tell me about their first years of marriage?
Yes, my father was a high officer in the port of Basra. He ran the transport department, which is the department responsible for all the ships coming in and out. My mother was a housewife. We lived in a community very close to the port. They belonged to the British Officers Club. Most of their friends were British, and actually my mother's best friend was a Christian and Catholic woman that they kept in touch forever and ever, until my mother passed away. So they were very close to Christians, not just Jews, and they had all their parties with the officers, and they had a very good, comfortable life in Basra.
Okay. Your father was imprisoned. Was this during this period of time when they were in?
My father was imprisoned during the War of Independence, and after. They rounded up a lot of Jews, and they executed the influential ones, the very wealthy ones. There's a famous character, Adas, was hung in the public square for all to see. So that day when my father was in prison, they imprisoned about 50 Jews, influential Jews from the port of Basra. One guy gave the names, and there was the head bookkeeper, accountant, there was my father, there were many, many others in there. The interesting thing is we had already, we realized what the situation was happening, and my father influenced the British to give him immigration to Australia. So we had packed, left our home, and stayed with my aunt, waiting for the ship to take us to Australia. And my mother kept telling my father, let's take a plane. Let's not wait for the ship. It's getting worse and worse, and more people are being imprisoned every day. He said, but I'm not involved in any politics. Nobody's going to do anything to me. She said, everybody's being imprisoned had nothing to do with politics. They're just Jews. So he didn't want to, and one morning, I was 6 years old. My father was shaving, and there was a knock on the door, and of course I ran to open, and there were two officers with guns. I almost fainted. I will never forget that. And I ran to call my father. He came in with shaving cream halfway on his face, And there were two officers. They asked him if he was Salim Somech. He said yes. And they said, we have orders to search you. Well, as I said, this was not our home. This was my aunt's home. But our luggage was all prepared to leave. They opened every single luggage. They threw everything around. They didn't find anything incriminating. But they still took him. And my mother and I ran after the truck, screaming, and he's trying to calm us down. Don't worry, I'll be back. Don't worry, I'll be back. And I remember this was the most difficult time of my life because the adults didn't want to tell me what's going on. I was like a nudnik, a nudge. I kept wanting to know what's happening, and they wouldn't tell me. Every time the doorbell rang, I would run thinking my father was coming back. But now I know that my mother was working through the British officers, through her Catholic friend whose husband was a member of Parliament. And the trial hadn't happened yet. He was still being held. And when the trial, oh, and another thing, I don't want to forget that one. My aunt was a friend of Adas, the family, the guy who was executed. And my mother said, he's so influential, please go talk to him. She was set up to go, and she found out that he was executed. So anyway, so when my father was taken into, when they had the court actually, with all of the people who were from the port of Basra, my mother's friend's husband, the Catholic, went to court, wanted to be a witness on behalf of my father. They wouldn't let him in, even though he was a member of Parliament. And so they had a witness against every one of them, a witness who didn't even know the person, telling him this stories about whatever they accused them of. Those were the stories that were told. And so my father was accused of being a Zionist and a communist. And anyone who knew the Iraqi community, those two groups were fighting each other because one believed they belonged to Iraq, one believed they should go to Israel. So, and my father was neither. That was the funny part of it. And the witness got up and said, he saw my father distribute cigarettes in an anti-government demonstration, and he was saying, down with the government, down with the government. My father, I guess naive, believed in justice, raised his hand, asked the judge if he can speak on his own behalf. Everybody was shocked, and my father said, I can prove that on the day this witness is saying that I distributed cigarettes in Basra in the demonstration, the port sent me to Baghdad. I wasn't in Basra all day long. I can prove it. So the judge said, sit down. Are you saying that this Muslim witness is a liar? And my mother says that everybody in court saw that he crossed out something and wrote something else on the paper in front of him. Everyone got 3 years. My father got 5 for speaking on his behalf. And that was it. He was sent to very far away in prison. We had to take, I remember, trains in the dusty air of Iraq, and we'd go visit him. And he became very good friends with the head of the Communist Party. He was an Armenian redhead. And my mother would tell him, I was too little to understand the significance, but I remember my mother would tell him, why are you befriending this guy? He's going to be executed. They'll execute you too. He says, no, they won't do anything to me. He really believed that everything was honest. And anyway, thank God they didn't execute him. But my mother couldn't stay in Basra, so she and myself and my brother moved to Baghdad to stay with my other aunt. And I was older. I was 7, 6 and a half, something like that. So they put me in a French convent, sleepaway French convent, not just day school. And I remember feeling dumped because my brother stayed with her, and I was dumped in a convent, and I hated it. They were very strict. You had to go to church and pray. And my mother was in that convent until age 17. She loved it. So she thought it was good for me. I hated it because of the circumstances. It wasn't just, how would you like to try a school? It was, your father's gone, there's no one to defend you. Here you are in the school, I'll keep the baby. My brother was 1.5 years too, something like that. So my father didn't want us to stay in Iraq. He didn't know what the situation was going to be. And at that time, through an influence on the Iraqi government, because there were so many escapes of Iraqi Jews from Iraq through Basra to Iran, and the Shah was helping them to get to Israel. It was very embarrassing to the Iraqi government. And so some Jews influenced them. They said, look, not too many Jews want to leave. Give them permit to leave. And so there was a decree that any Jew who wants to give up his Iraqi citizenship, he can go. There were centers, most of them in synagogues, give up his citizenship, and there are planes who would take them. So at first nobody wanted to do it because they thought they would put them in prison to find out who wants to leave. But then a few people did it and nothing happened to them. And then en masse, 85% of the Jewish community gave up its citizenship, which was a total shock. No one believed that this ancient community would actually decide to leave. From the poor to the rich, all. My father told my mother to go give up her citizenship, but it was already late. It was towards the end, and they gave 1 year for all the planes to get out, whoever wanted to. So it was unacceptable to live in Iraq after you've given up your citizenship and yet you can't leave. So my father was afraid that this would be the situation, that the year would pass, my mother would have no citizenship. And so he told her, you have to make contacts and escape Iraq. And that's what happened. My mother got some people to get a group. We were about 15 to 20. These memories are very scant. It's only the horrific pictures that I remember. There was another picture when my father was sentenced with all the Jews. There were about 100 Jews walked in leg chains in the streets of Baghdad, parading them all over to get them to the train to send them to prison. It was horrible. I can still hear the noise of the leg iron on the road leading to the buses and everybody crying and screaming. Anyway, so those are the things you remember as a little girl. You don't remember the details. So we went one night. They took us. It's actually Iraqi Arabs who get a lot of money to do it. We went to a house, a remote house in Basra, and we wait there until late night. And then we start marching on foot in the cold. Some of them were smart. They wore 3-4 dresses, one on top of the other, and a coat. My mother didn't know about that, so she just put a coat on top of whatever we were wearing. And we marched quite a bit. It was hours that we walked and walked. And then there were sounds. At night you can hear everything. And we heard horses. We were sure the police was going to get us because those who were caught were put in jail for a long time. And we were very afraid of that. And there was one 18-year-old girl, her name was Amal. She was screaming, they're coming to get us. And she scared me so much. And so eventually they came, but not the police. We heard shots, and it was up in the air. It wasn't to get us. It was obvious that the people who took us tell their friends that we're taking a group because all they wanted is our belonging. They knew where we would be. They knew when we would be there. They took everything, all the watches and rings and coats and everything. My brother and I were freezing. And my brother was little. He started throwing up from the sound of gunshots. He was so scared. And I remember my mother saying to one of the guys, you carry him. You brought these people here, so you carry him now because he's throwing up. And eventually we get into a little river, and there are boats waiting for us. We sit in the boats, and we get to the Iranian side, and the Iranians are expecting us. They open, there's a big fence there, a wall that has a gate. We go in there, and then from there we go to Tehran. Most of the Jews waited for the laissez-passer to Israel, to I think Cyprus and then Israel. They renovated they had a building in the cemetery in Tehran. Most of the Jews were waiting there, sleeping on the floors, hundreds of them, until each group left. Some of them waited for 6 months. And we had family there, great aunts and whatever. So we stayed with them until we got our laissez-passer and left, went to Israel. So we arrived in Israel in January 51. And I remember there were a lot of Iranian Jews who were leaving too. Even though the Shah was good to the Jews, the wealthy remained. It was the poor who decided this is a chance to get out, and they heard that it's easier in Israel for some people. And so there were a lot of Iranians, and when we came to the port, they put us all in a big room, and they had DDT. There was a room full of smoke, white smoke, DDT. And my mother spoke English. She said to the woman, "Please look at my children. They're so clean. Do you need to put DDT on them?" And I remember we left. We didn't go through that room. So they didn't fumigate us. So that was the time when my name was changed from Carmen to Carmella. He asked my mother, "What's your name?" She said, "Rachel." So he wrote Rachel. "What's his name?" Sasson. He wrote Sasson. "What's her name?" Carmen. "What is Carmen?" "Carmella." She said, "Okay." So that was it. And when we got to Israel, I wouldn't let anybody call me Carmen anymore. And the thing that fascinated me about Israel, my mother was telling me, "It's wonderful, we'll go there." And I was very close to my father. "We leave him here." She said, "He'll join us, don't worry." And she said, "Everybody's Jewish in Israel." I said, "Even the police and the army?" Because I was so scared of them, really scared. And that is the thing that got me to want to go to Israel, to find out that everybody was Jewish and I didn't have to be afraid of them. So that was the Iraqi part of my life. And of course my mother couldn't. You want me to continue about Israel?
Keep going. Keep talking. It's good.
My mother then wouldn't stay in what they called Shar Aliyah, which is the places where all the Jews.
I just want to tell them not to scream because.
I'll keep it rolling.
Yeah, just keep it rolling. Sorry. So you were saying in Shar Aliyah.
Yeah, in Shar Aliyah, which is the immigration center. Everybody went to Shar Aliyah, and from there they would move them to different places, wherever they had to go. But you had to go to Shar Aliyah. And then some of the young people, the kids, would be taken to kibbutzim, youth aliyah. My mother her grandparents had left Iraq. They were very wealthy. They left Iraq much earlier, before the War of Independence of Israel. So they had a house in Jerusalem. But my aunt and uncle and their kids arrived first, so they went to live with them. They couldn't take 2 more children. So my mother, though, took a cab that night straight to Jerusalem, to her mother. And then within that week, she went to meet with the guy in charge of Youth Aliyah. And he told her that there's no way they would take the kids to a kibbutz if they're living in a home in Jerusalem. She had to go to Shar Aliyah. So we went to Shar Aliyah, and we were in a tent for about a month. And then they took me to a kibbutz in the north, and they took my brother to a youth hostel somewhere else. And my mother went to live with her parents in Jerusalem. My father joined us about 2.5 years later. He was in for 4.5 years because the UN interceded with Iraq. bless you. And they released all of the Jews who were still in prison in Iraq. So my father left after 4.5 instead of completing his 5 years. And by that time, I didn't know any Arabic. I didn't know any English. I only spoke Hebrew. I refused to answer in Arabic. I wanted to close that gate. And my father shows up, and all he knows is Arabic and English. So, and he's an Anglophile. He loves the British. That was me.
Is that your phone?
Yeah, shall we wait a minute?
I'll cut it.
Yeah. Here. Okay.
So my father comes to Israel, and I have to say, before my father came, my mother went to Ulpan, and they're very good with languages, my family, all of us, actually. And so she went to Ulpan, and she was speaking Hebrew very well, and the first time she comes to visit me, I see her with a pantsuit. I was shocked. Iraqi women never wore pants, never. And I looked at her, and never mind that I was wearing these short pants with elastics, but we were kids. And to see my mother with pants, So that was the first shock I got. And then the next time she came, she brought my father 2.5 years later. And he was gray, completely gray, very thin. And he wanted to speak Arabic or English, which I couldn't speak. I could understand Arabic, but I was embarrassed. I was really embarrassed. I didn't want to speak Arabic. I didn't want to have anything to do with that culture. And I was very close to my father as a child. I remained close to him later. But that day really brought me back to Iraq, and I didn't want to be there. But of course, as soon as he left, he went to Ulpan, and he got a letter from the kibbutz to take me out because I wasn't suited for kibbutz life. I tried to organize all the Middle Eastern kids who were there to escape. And we escaped from the kibbutz, and, so I had a reputation of not kibbutz type. So they asked my father to get me out of the kibbutz. And he said as soon as he's finished with the Ulpan, had a job, he would. And he worked in the port of Jaffa right away. He got a job. His Hebrew became superb in a very short time. And so I left, and we lived in Tel Aviv. And I really wanted nothing to do with Iraq until much later, when things relaxed and we started talking about culture. And even in Israel, when I came to Israel, the kibbutz was made up of German Jews and Hungarian Jews. And I understood right away, I was 8, but I understood that all the sounds that come from the throat are not good sounds, and they discriminate against you if you speak that way. So right away I dropped the ayin, I dropped all of the ka and those right away, because I could hear what they wanted. The problem is I didn't know what accent to imitate. They were Hungarian, they were German, they both spoke completely differently. So, but I knew that I had to sound somewhat like them in order to be accepted in the society. These were the early days. Later on, it was completely different. Iraqi Jews did much better, and some of them became very well known in the country. And so we were less embarrassed to say that we are from Iraq. I used to say I was from India because I was born there. I had an excuse. I wasn't 100% lying, just 80%. So that was it. And now, in terms of what we left behind, we left property. All my mother's jewelry was in vaults. My aunt, with whom we lived in Baghdad, remained. There were the 20% that remained and left. Most of them left in the 60s. My mother's uncle was the head of all the railroad in Iraq. So when they were imprisoning Jews and executing, he escaped. He left for Europe. And then when things calmed down, he returned. And he lived there until 60-something, 66, I think, when they all left. And And so my uncle told her that, don't worry, we'll worry about your jewelry. But of course, everything was nationalized and taken, all the property, everything. My uncle left in the 60s, my uncle and aunt and their children. They went to England. They were in partnership with Muslims, so they thought they were partially protected. They were at that time. But later, of course, when they left to England, the business was taken over without any payment to them, you know. So I don't think there was anybody who wasn't affected in some way. Those who were very wealthy left earlier, but they left a lot of wealth behind, which they could never get. Those who didn't leave early suffered physically. So, you know, those who stayed until there was one family, for instance, whose father was executed in the square. Much later, I'm talking about. Her brother was sent to the war against Iran. I'm talking now about Saddam Hussein. And when he survived, they sent him again. They were hoping he would die. And then the Americans rescued her and pulled her mother and her brother out of Iraq and brought them to the United States. When my son returned with the American army, he helped get some of the Jews out that remained, that wanted to leave. Some said they were too old to leave, and there were Torahs in the synagogue that he had arranged for a helicopter to take all these Torahs out, but a guy who was in charge of the synagogue wouldn't let him. He said, no, they're staying here. So he said, well, I can't, I had no influence over that. It's their right to do that. But he did go to the museum, and there were 385 Torahs from all over Iraq in the Baghdad Museum, which maybe someday we'll be able to get back. He said a lot of the silver was taken out and so on, but you could see the names of the families who donated it. So
I'm going to go through questions
Okay,
now, but
okay.
that was great.
Okay.
I wish everyone would do that. But before I do, just one quick question. If you had to put an estimate on the value of your family's assets that were left behind in dollars, what would your guess be?
Look, you're asking me to put an estimate in dollars. The majority of the loss is all of my mother's jewelry and the expensive stuff that we left. My grandparents lost a lot of their precious thing. They left early, but the situation wasn't that good, so they couldn't take everything. So all of their silver and jewelry they could take because it was small, but everything in the household, they sold their house to the neighbor for pittance, you know. So in that sense, I really don't know how to estimate diamonds and pearls and gold. I have no idea. Okay. But everything that my mother owned was in that safe. So
and there's also communal assets that everyone is.
Right. The Torahs and yeah, I'm telling you, just Baghdad, 385. Then there were some in the palace of Saddam Hussein that were brought into the United States because they were in water. They brought them to repair them. So Iraq is demanding them back. Yeah. So anyway.
Okay. Do you remember Baghdad? What are your visual memories of what Baghdad was like when you were there as a child?
I don't really remember much. You know, I remember the very good and the very bad. Streets and stuff like that. I was in a convent from age 6 and a half. I didn't go out. I was in that convent. You asked me about the convent. I'll tell you that I remember. About Baghdad, all I remember is when we lived with my aunt and uncle. In the summer, when the water is down, islands come up. And the Jews, or everybody who had money to do that would hire a boatman and go in a rowboat to one of these islands with fish that they would stand on pieces of wood. They would actually stand them, and they're cooked on fire like barbecue with a special mixture of spices that they put on it. They were fish that had a lot of bone, and what I remember is they wouldn't let me eat that. And my uncle would take all the bone out and put it in my plate. And I remember the fun we used to have as kids on these islands, running around and so on, swimming. My father had taught me to swim in the port of in the port club. So I learned how to swim, and we used to have a lot of fun. That I remember, but that's the only memory I have of Baghdad. That's the wonderful thing that's stuck in my mind.
And what is the opposite memory?
The opposite is my father's imprisonment. That is really something, the fear of these officers coming in, the search in the suitcases, they're taking him out and my mother and I running after them. They're walking him in the street in leg iron. It is so humiliating, with all the Muslims cursing at them, and all the Jews running after them and crying to the trains, and then they load them up on the trains, and the men peeking out and crying. And my father, I'll never forget that, said to one of the men standing here, "What's the matter with you? Be strong for your family. Don't cry. Give them courage." That was my father. So those are the only thing. And our visiting him in prison. I remember that one. I remember taking the train to prison. I remember him and my mother fighting over little thing. Should she leave Iraq? Should he be friendly with the Armenian? All of these little things. And I remember how I hated the convent, hated it. And I just wanted to get out. And I remember my mother told me, "We're going to leave Iraq. Don't tell them. We are escaping to Iran. Don't tell anybody. It's a secret." Well, the next day I went to all the nuns and told them that we are escaping, we're leaving. We're leaving Iraq, we're escaping. I was so happy that I had to go tell them. So she kept telling me, don't tell, So those are the things I remember. And the escape. The escape was a horrific experience. It was fear from the moment the sun set. It was pitch black. They choose nights that have no moon. It's pitch black. And we walk and walk and walk, and the sound carries at night. So every time you hear a gunshot, you hear horses, everything seems that they're all coming at you to get you, because we all knew you end up in prison. And I already knew what prison was like. So it was terrible. And then the shooting, oh my God. And when the shooting occurred, a man, a relative that my mother was escaping with, because everybody had to be with a man in the Middle East. You cannot be a woman alone with children. So they arranged to escape with another relative. And he just pushed me. There was a hill and there was a slope. So he pushed me down the slope because the 18-year-old Amal jumped down. And so he pushed me to go with her so they don't get me. But they saw us. And they came and they picked us up and they brought us up again. And they took my coat and they took my brother's coat, took my mother's coat, her wedding ring, her watch, everything. We arrived in Tehran freezing, absolutely freezing.
So remember to answer with the questions.
Yeah, I did. I did this.
So when you were a child, were you aware that all of this pressure that your family experienced in your father's imprisonment was because he was Jewish? Or, were you aware that you were victims because of your religion?
You're asking if I knew that everything that was happening because we were Jews? There was no doubt about it. No doubt about it. because I kept hearing that all the Jews are being imprisoned. My mother said to my father, let's go, let's take the planes, that Jews are being executed and imprisoned. So I knew it was all about Jews. Kept hearing Israel, 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 so I knew that everything was connected somehow. And, so even after they came back from the trial, and everybody was very, very down. Of course, I didn't go, and I wanted to know. They kept pushing me aside. Nobody had patience to explain to a kid what's going on. And I heard the word naive. He's so naive. He's so naive. And I remember thinking naive was a bad word because I didn't know what naive was. And later I understood he was naive because he even thought that they would listen to him. So he got 2 years more because he wanted justice. So it was very clear that everything was because we were Jews. Very, very clear. There was no, and they even said that in court they didn't let their friends speak because they didn't want anybody to speak on behalf of the Jews.
When you were in the French Catholic school, did you experience anti-Semitism from the nuns or from the students that were there?
No, I didn't experience any. Oh, when I was in the convent, I didn't experience any anti-Semitism as such. But this was a convent. They wanted Catholics. They were Muslims there too. And so they would take us all to church. And but when I remember the thing that I felt discriminated against, it wasn't because I was Jew. Well, maybe it was because I was Jewish, not Catholic, but not really discrimination. They would say that Jesus, if you lost a tooth, Jesus would give you a gift. In the morning you wake up and under your pillow there was a gift from Jesus. Well, I lost a tooth. I didn't get a gift from Jesus. Well, this was obvious, but to a child, that was a feeling of they didn't care for me, but it really wasn't. I mean,
were your mother and father Zionists? Not like, I'm not asking if they aligned themselves with the Zionist party that was in conflict with the communists, but did they have Zionist feelings and this desire to support Israel and...
Okay, you are asking if my mother and father were Zionists. There are different ways to look at that. There is to be Zionist, to join the Zionist movement, which I already mentioned that they never joined the Zionist movement. My father was actually very afraid of joining any political thing in Iraq because his father was executed by the Turks during First World War because he did business with the British, and they accused him of spying with the British. And so he was executed, and it was very... nobody touched politics. My cousin, who was a professor at Tel Aviv University later on, he was a teenager in Iraq, he very much identified with the communists, but he was told never to go to meetings, never to participate. So political involvement for our family, because of my grandfather, was no. So in that sense, they were not Zionists. Their parents, my mother's parents, were living in Israel. So what happens in Israel was very important to them in the War of Independence. They got a letter from my grandparents telling them where all their money was around the world because they thought they would be annihilated. Okay? So that, in that sense, it was very important. Also, my grandfather had bought a lot of property in Israel for all his children. So in that sense, we were involved in Israel. Another way to show that we were not Zionist, my father never intended to make Aliyah to Israel. They were going to go to Australia. They had everything packed. If the ship had come earlier, I would have been an Australian, So so Israel was not a priority for them at the time.
So I know your mother is a fantastic chef, and she's shared her recipes. What were some of your favorite foods that she cooked? Your favorite Iraqi dish?
There is we all cook. My son is a fantastic Iraqi cook, really fantastic. He is the one who got all her recipes. So the actual written recipes at the site is my son's doing, the introduction to each segment of it and so on. That was my son. He started in Israel the first public defender's office in Tel Aviv, so he lived with my mother for 10 months. So he would watch her, because, I don't either. I don't know how much salt I put, how much pepper I put, a little of this, a little of that. So he watched her and had her measure so that he could write the recipes down. So we all cook it, but you wanted to know my mother's most favored recipe that we all love is an eggplant dish called ngri with meat at the bottom, then onions and tomatoes, and layers of eggplant on top with sweet and sour flavor. It is phenomenal, So, but there are many, many recipes, and my mother she learned both from her mother and her mother-in-law. My grandmother from my father's side was a very good cook too.
So, I know you were very young, but when the Jews of Iraq were leaving, was there a sense of sadness that they were leaving 3,000 years of history behind and returning was uncertain? Were people vocal?
Okay, you wanted to know if there was a sadness that they were leaving. I know that my grandparents, my mother's parents, were very, very sad. They were a lot more involved in the Iraqi Jewish community than my father was involved. My father had to support the family. His father was executed. He was studying in India for 2 years. All his formal education is 2 years in India. There were Anglophiles, and my grandfather wanted him educated in the British system, so he sent him at age 6 to India. So they brought him back at age 9. He had to go to work. So he started being a delivery boy at the port of Basra, and he learned from the British English. And he was very good in languages. His English was phenomenal, superb. I've been living here for 1,000,000 years, and I don't speak it as well as my father, certainly don't write it as well as my father wrote it. It was really unbelievable. So, and his Hebrew was the same way. Until the day he died, he would underline expressions that he wasn't very familiar with or something like that. So he was working. He supported a family. They were not at all involved in the Iraqi Jewish community. He was more involved with the British. My grandparents, my mother's parents, were very involved. My grandfather was the head of the Jewish community at one point, and there are lots of stories. They were theosophists also, but they were very much Jews, and they never ate meat because they believed, that animals, mercy for animals and so on and so forth, so they didn't eat meat. And at one point, my grandfather, who became the head of the community, discovered that the guy before him was embezzling money from the community, and he revealed it. And so he started talking about him, that they worship snakes, they're not Jews, and he caused him to be excommunicated. So my grandfather was very wealthy, opened a butcher place in one of his properties, and hired a guy to be a semi-rabbi and a butcher and all of the little things. And because they didn't pay taxes, it was very cheap. So all of a sudden, all the Jewish women would wear abaya, where you couldn't see who they are, and they would come to buy the meat from there. And the guy comes to him and he says, "We ran out of meat. I need another cow to butcher." He said, "What do you mean? We don't have that many families who are excommunicated." He said, "All of them are coming to buy here." So the rabbinate was hysterical. They weren't making enough money. So then they wanted to meet with my grandfather. He says, "Under one condition, you write an apology in the paper to whatever you said about me, and you accept me officially to the Jewish community," and that's how it ended. But he was the head of the Jewish community. They were very involved. And I know that they really felt that something very important was ended. Very important. The Jewish community in Iraq was so significant, more than any other community, Jewish community in the Middle East. It was the beginning of Jewish communities in the Middle East. It was the Talmud. And that was in every Jew's consciousness. So for them who are involved in the Jewish community to feel that the door is closed behind it was very painful.
Do you have memories of going to a synagogue in Iraq? Did you ever go?
I don't remember. I really don't. I was 6 and then I was in a convent. So I don't remember.
Do you have memories of any of the holidays being celebrated?
Yeah, sure. All the holidays. That I remember. I remember Passover with my grandfather. It was unbelievable. It was really great.
Okay. Were there any, well, I guess you actually just talked about this. Do you want to talk a little bit about the conflict between the communists and the Zionists?
Yeah. There was a huge communist group. Communism started in Iraq around the time that nationalism developed in Iraq. Nationalism started around the First World War, and they wanted the British out too, because the British were ruling Iraq, and they wanted them out. But nationalism also didn't include the Jews who were there before them. They wanted the Jews. They were anti-Jewish as well, and that's why the Nazi Party was suitable for them, because it was to eliminate the Jews. And so there was an Armenian guy, I forget his name. He was a redhead. Everybody called him the Armenian redhead. So I don't remember his name. He started the Communist Party in Iraq. He said, we are all equal. Christian, Jews, Muslims, we all should be equal. Rich, poor, all of us. And at that time, it got a lot of response. A lot of intellectuals went for it, just as in Russia. A lot of intellectuals, because it sounds good in the books. So, as I said, Sami Mikhail, the famous author, Fatal was a communist. My cousin, Sasson Somech, was a communist in head, but as I mentioned, he wasn't allowed to join any party because of my grandfather's execution. So they intellectually, it appealed to them. We are here, this is our home, for thousands of years. Why we should leave it and leave it to the Arabs who came only in 622, or later even when they got to Iraq. So anyway, the party got a lot of support among the Jews, Christians, and some Muslims too. Others, middle class and below, were saying, we will never be equal. There's no place here for us. It's finished. First World War had showed us that it will never happen. We need to get out of here. So as Israel started establishing, and the problem with the British, the Arabs in Israel and Palestine, and the Jews were struggling there, there were problems in Iraq, again, started. So some of the Jews joined the Zionist party, and Israel sent some of the Jews to Iraq to create more enthusiasm among them to take Zionism. There you had the youth more. So they would meet in different places. They collected guns, some of them, and they organized the escape. At that time, there was no permission to leave by plane. They organized the escapes. There was a bomb in one of the synagogues. They claim it was the Zionist movement in order to create hysteria among Jews to want to leave. I don't know if it's the truth or not. But anyway, so eventually the communists escaped too, because they were wanted by the government. They were wanted by the government anyway, so they had to leave anyway. So, but the two groups battled battled intellectually. One said, this is our home. If we get equality, we'll all be the same. The other one said they will never accept the Jews as the same. We'd better leave here. We have a country. Let's go build it. Let's go create it. Let's go live as Jews without being afraid. So those were the struggles. Eventually, those escaped and those escaped. And what happened also, they created, around the time of the War of Independence, they created a military government, a military tribunal. It's like a court, a military court. No longer did they judge Jews or Christians or Zionists, communists, or whatever in regular courts. It was all military. So there was no system of justice, not that the regular courts were that much better, but at least those could do whatever they wanted. There's a relative of mine, a Dalal, by marriage. His younger brother was an ardent communist, and they caught him. And the military tribunal could only deal with 18 years and older. They couldn't try people who were younger. He was 16 years old when they caught him. So they asked him in court, how old are you? He said 16. They said, Uktub tamantash, write 18. Okay? So it didn't matter how old you were. If he wrote 18, you're 18. That's it. And they executed him. So eventually Sami Mikhail escaped, and Salim Fatal escaped, or came on, I don't know if Salim escaped or came. Sami Mikhail had to escape. He had no time to wait because his name was among the wanted communists.
Fatal went through Iran.
Oh, okay, so he escaped too. Yeah. He escaped too. A lot of people who were very active in the communist movement had to escape because they couldn't wait to go through the regular flight.
So there's a lot of younger people, younger Iraqi Jews, Rachel Shabi, and they say that the Iraqi Jews didn't have it so bad, and that Zionism was what forced them to leave, and Zionism is the reason why all of the Muslims and the Arabs started hating the Iraqi Jews. What would your response be to young Iraqi Jews who have this idea that everything was good?
I would ask them what happened. Why did we have the Farhud? The Farhud was 3 days, 3 whole days of killing, raping Jews, breaking into businesses, stealing, going into homes. It was just terrible, terrible. This was in the Second World War. What Zionism? We didn't even know about Zionism at the time. There was Herzl, but they certainly didn't do it for that. So it's not true to say that. It really isn't. The feeling of nationalism in Iraq was the cause of this. Nationalism did not include the Jews, even though they were there for thousands of years. It didn't include the Jews. So there was a period of calm. It started again with Israel, not so much Zionism. But there were Jews who were communists. You ask Sami Mikhail, he'd tell you, the Zionist group was very small. It's the communists who were influential, the Jewish communists. So it's really not because of Zionism in Israel. Israel was a good target. Okay, it's like the world today says, because of Israel, we have all these problems with the Middle East, with the wars in the Middle East. Israel is only a target that sounds good, but it's not. The same thing then. Nationalism was growing. They didn't want the British. They didn't want the Jews. Why didn't Jews went begging the British do something during the 3 days of looting and killing and so on, do something. The British were scared because it was against them too. They didn't want to stop them. They'd rather sacrifice the Jews than themselves. So I don't agree with this. There's another misconception that is in the hearts of a lot of people. The Christians were much worse to the Jews than the Muslims were. True and false. When we talk about Christians, we talk about the Inquisition. Okay, that is true. That is true. But there were periods, horrible periods for the Jews among Muslims. There was no Inquisition, but there were forced conversions. There were, my grandfather was executed in First World War. What is that? Why? And he was accused of spy. Did you bring witnesses to say, is he a spy, is he not? They sent people all the way to Turkey to stop it, to say he's not a spy. It didn't succeed. So it's really not true. It depends on the period. It depends on the ruler, just as it is true with Christianity, other than I would take what happened in Spain and Portugal as a separate period. But Christianity was anti-Semitic, and so was Islam. And look what's happening in Islam today.
Yeah. Did you know, or anyone in your family know of any girls who were kidnapped and forced to convert, or of any Iraqi individuals who were forced to convert to Islam?
I don't know if anybody was forced to convert to Islam. Okay. I don't.
Did you have any strong relationships with Muslims in Iraq? Any Muslim friends? Any positive memories?
I myself, as I said, I was little. I was in a convent, so I didn't have any friends. Period. There was no, I was very young, and then the convent. I didn't have any friends. I hated it so much. And I'm thinking about more my parents. My parents had more Christian friends. First of all, the language they spoke was closer. It was closer to the proper Arabic. The Muslim Arabic came from the Bedouin tribes that came from Saudi north during the expansion of Islam. And so it was a little different. And it was easier for Jews and Christians to befriend each other.
So can you tell the story about being in the kibbutz and the discrimination that you might have experienced? You said that you rallied all of the Mizrahi kids.
I was terrible. I mean, I didn't like it, and when I don't like something, I don't give up. What happened is, first of all, the language. Some people couldn't change. They don't have a good ear to languages. I mean, listen to Israelis who've been here 30, 40 years, and they still speak like Israelis. I had a better ear, and I realized that what they're saying is, if you're identified as a Middle Easterner, you are not at the level of the Ashkenazim. You're below. This was very clear to me, even though I was 8. I already understood that. So I right away eliminated all the guttural sounds, and I spoke like Israelis. I couldn't say ah, I couldn't say ka, I couldn't say any of these things. I eliminated that. So, and for the longest time, I mean, I'll give you an example. I was in the army, and I worked in intelligence because I read Arabic. I studied Arabic, was my major in school, in high school. So I read English, I read Arabic, and so I was in the censorship for letters, not for newspapers. And so we would get all these letters, and we would read them. And next to me, there was a very, very secret entity about what the Israelis were doing with Arab countries. And we were not allowed to enter. And there you had only civilians working there. So people don't know that it's... And the front of the base was all truck repair. So it would look like a nothing base, even though it said intelligence. Inside was all the censorship and the other place I'm talking about. So Ben-Gurion came to visit them to see what they were doing. And they chose me to give him, to offer him orange juice. They told me, don't look at the walls. We don't want you to see what we're doing, but we want you to give him the orange juice. And they said, they gave me a sentence to tell him, Your Honor, Mr. Prime Minister, fresh orange juice for you, or something like that. Well, Ben-Gurion was known not to go for the standard stuff. He wanted to know more. So I come, and I say, Mr. Prime Minister, he didn't let me finish. And he said, Samelet, Sergeant, where are you from? No, what's your name? I said, Carmella Somich. Oh, you're Iraqi? Well, I thought I wanted to die. because everybody was standing around, and in front of everyone he says to me, "Are you Iraqi?" I was so embarrassed. And I said, "No, I was born in India." So he says to me, "Are you B'nai Israel? That's even worse than Iraqis." So I said, "No, my parents are from Iraq." "So you Iraqi, say you are Iraqi." He actually, it's very funny, because he thought the highest of Iraqi Jews. He said they are the only pure Jews we have in the world. And so he thought very highly of them, but I was too embarrassed to say I'm Iraqi. So that was the period when there was a lot of discrimination against Middle Eastern Jews, because they really saw us at the level of the lowest Arab. So it was, that was a period. Later on it was a little different, but that was a period.
Were your parents able to be fully absorbed, like your father? Did he ever?
Yes. We have a funny story there too. My father. You want to know how my parents were absorbed? First of all, my mother's Hebrew was superb, and so was my father. No gutter letters at all. They spoke like Israelis. She spoke like a typical Israeli. He spoke like a well-educated Israeli. Now remember, he only had 2 years of schooling. So everything is self-taught, and he was unbelievable. So many years later, we moved to a small little area by Petah Tikva called Kiryat Matalon, because my grandfather had a house there, and he said, "Why don't you move in there?" So the bus to Petah Tikva would stop at Kiryat Matalon, but it was big. A lot of elderly people had to walk very far to get to their homes. So he was on the board of the city council, parallel to city council in Petah Tikva. So he did a lot of things. He convinced him to get a bus to go through Kiryat Matalon, through the main street, and then go back to the main street of main road leading to Petah Tikva. And at one point, he's sitting they forgot he's Iraqi, because his Hebrew is superb, no Iraqi accent or anything. And they say, we have so many Mizrahim here, and we have to make sure they don't take over. We have to be... And then they realized, they said, well, of course there are exceptions, Mr. Somech, we love you here, and so on and so forth. But there was tremendous discrimination. One of the girls who was with me in the censorship met one of the guys the civilians who worked in that secret intelligence project. They fell madly in love, and he was well educated, very much intellectual. They fell so madly in love, her parents would absolutely not let her marry him. And I talked to my cousin about a month ago. He says, "Carmella, you know what the miracle of Israel is?" He said, "I used to think that it's the language. To take a biblical dead language and create it into a living language is unparalleled. No one ever did that." And he said, "But you know what? I was in 6 weddings in the last 2 months. Only 2 of them are Ashkenazi to Ashkenazi. All of them are intermarriage between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi." He said, "And no one ever looked Mizrahi, no Mizrahi. It is so beautiful to see this." So it's a different time now.
Yeah. So can you tell me about your decision to move to the United States and to leave Israel?
Oh, that you want to know about why I'm in the United States. Actually, my father never believed there will be peace with the Arabs. Never. He said, "I know them. They will never accept an educated, enlightened nation among them. Never. So I want my children to get out of the country." So since I was born in India, he forced the British embassy, forced them. He went over and all the way up to the ambassador and said, "What do you mean? She was born in India when India was under the British, so she should have a British passport." And he finally got me a British passport. Not such an honor, because it says British subject, and they treat you as a subject. Anyway, I got, so as soon as I finished the army, they sent me to England to study. I lived there for 2 years. I studied there, and I wanted to go back. And my uncle, who left Iraq in the 60s, he was first debriefed in Israel because he knew everything about Iraq, and then he came to England because he had 2 children in the United States, in New York. He loved me so much. He said, I really want you to go to the United States, meet my son. I will give you anything you want. I will set you up in anything you want. I'll do everything for you. Just meet my son. If you marry him, it's all yours, whatever you want. So I said to my parents, Shidduch? They said, what do you care? You'll see New York, go. So they sent me to New York. I met my handsome cousin. He wasn't for me. And so I said, I spent so much of my parents' money here. How can I live like that? I quickly went to register in college. I got myself a job teaching. And I graduated college. So I never went back. Actually, I did want to go back. I really loved Israel. I wanted to go back to Israel after 3 years of college. I had 1 more year to finish. I got to Israel, and I sent a letter with my transcripts to Tel Aviv University. I said, I finished 3 in the United States. You need 4. I need 1 more year. Can I please finish at Tel Aviv University? Because I want to come back. Never got an answer. I came back. I finished. I graduated. A year later, my mother says, you got something from Tel Aviv University. That was a response a year later. But by that time, I was married,
When did your brother come to the United States?
My brother finished his BA in Israel. He married an Israeli girl. He finished his BA, and he worked. My brother's very bright. He worked at the Weizmann Institute, when he was in high school. My father arranged that. He was studying in high school, and he arranged for him in the summer to go work there. And they loved him so much. They thought he contributed so much. They said he graduated 6 months before army time. So they said, as soon as you graduate, we want you here full time, we'll pay you. So he worked for them 6 months and went to the army. And then when he went to study for his BA, he worked for them too. And they said, we want to send you to the United States, we will pay for you for your PhD, but under condition that you come back. But then a professor from Caltech came to Israel and was talking about all the research he was doing. And he went back and he told his wife, I met my future. And through him, he got into Caltech and did his BA there, and his PhD in Caltech. So.
Did your parents ever move here or live here, or did they stay?
Never.
Why not?
I didn't want to become a citizen at the beginning. For many, many years, I wasn't a citizen until my brother wanted to come here. He said, hey, I finished, I'm coming for education. As soon as I'm finished, I want to be able to work here. Why don't you get your residency? So then I applied for my residency. I was married for several years already, so I got my citizenship right away. And he came to work in New Jersey and then moved back to Silicon Valley. But that's the reason I did it. I didn't do it for many, many years. I wasn't involved very much. Now I'm a lot more involved in the community. But at the time I wasn't that involved, and I was too busy. I had a little boy, and,
So what have you done to preserve your Mizrahi heritage, your Iraqi heritage?
Okay, what have I done to preserve my Iraqi heritage? I guess 2 things. I think you have to talk also about preserving your Judaism. I don't think you can preserve an Iraqi heritage without speaking about Judaism as well. I think they are intertwined. So first of all, I was very secular in Israel. And I had never fasted. In fact, my father would bring us food and say, if I go to hell, I want the whole family with me. So I got to England, and they fast. Stayed with my aunt. They fast. And my uncle said, you can't fast. There's no way you can stay away from food. And it was a challenge. So that's when I started fasting. And then I continued. I fasted until today. But what happened when I got to the United States, I realized I had nothing here. It's not a Jewish country, so you don't know if the holidays are coming. Your child grows up not knowing anything. So I decided that I put my son in a yeshiva, so he could at least study the yeshiva, day school. Actually, it's a day school. So, and while he was studying, while he was a little boy even, I would read to him. I used to teach Hebrew at the very beginning, and when I stayed in New York and I was doing my BA at the time, I taught Hebrew and I taught Ulpan as well. And in the library in the Jewish Agency, I found a book, Chazal Stories for Beginners. It was not for children. It was for adult beginners. I bought the three of them, Aleph, Bet, and Gimel. And one night I would read for my son in English, and one night I would read to him in Hebrew. And I would read Agadot Chazal. And I would explain, the stories are very short, but I would explain what the value that they're trying to teach. And he so loved it that every night we would discuss the values in stories. What are they trying to tell us, and what are the rabbis trying to teach us? So that he liked a lot. And we would also talk about Iraqi Jews, where I come from, what is the history, and what happened to Jews, and what happened to his grandfather. And there's Chacham Abdallah Somer, that he was famous. And so when he joined Kahal Yosef, this synagogue here, he bought a Haggadah here. And when he opened it, in the center page was a whole group of rabbis sitting for Pesach. And who is the central rabbi? Chacham Abdallah Somer. And he brought it home. Ima, look. So I also spoke only Hebrew to my son. Other than reading to him in English, I only spoke in Hebrew. So he grew up bilingual. He heard about the Iraqi community. He became a committed Jew, even though we did less at home, that he learned. The learning was more in school. We were traditional, Rosh Hashanah, holidays, and so on. So I think I did well because he's quite traditional. He married a girl who is too. So, and that's how they're raising their daughters.
So where do you consider your home to be?
The United States. This is the longest home I've ever had. My English is better than my Hebrew, even though I'm bilingual. But if it were to give a lecture, my English is much better than Hebrew. My higher education was here, So, but, it's very funny. American character and Israeli character are diametrically opposed. I put myself in the middle. I'm too subdued for Israelis and too loud for Americans. So I'm in the middle somewhere.
So you've been here for a long time now.
Long time.
As an adult who has life experiences, what are your feelings about your story of migration, your family's story?
Okay. In modern society, when you raise children, I see it with my grandchildren. We have 7 from my 2 stepchildren as well. I think there is a belief here that you have to spare your children from disappointment, from unhappiness, and you have to give them everything they want. Migrating under the circumstances that I did as a child is very painful, very unhappy, and terrible. It shouldn't happen to anybody. But I also think that a little bit of disappointment, a little bit of difficulty in life makes you stronger. Doesn't make you weaker. It makes you stronger. The conflicts that people have, the need for shrinks and so on, is precisely because you didn't tackle anything in life. And then the smallest little thing gives you, a shock. So I think that in that sense, there's something good. I mean, I try to see the good that comes from everything. I think death is the only thing you can't say there's a good thing in it, unless you believe that for sure that there's an afterlife. But I try to see the best, and I really think that I became stronger as a result of that. You have to. You absolutely have to.
Okay, do you have a message for anyone who might see this video?
Yes. First of all, I want to talk to the Middle Easterners. I think that I hear very often, oh my God, we're losing everything to the Ashkenazim and so on. We're not preserving it. There's nothing wrong with doing that. I belong to an Ashkenazi synagogue, and I was even the president of the synagogue. But you shouldn't not tell your children about the rich heritage that you come from. Middle Eastern Jews were a lot more traditional, but not shtetl crazy, strict as the Ashkenazim Orthodoxy were. We were, before we got to Israel, much more open mind. Actually, people say about the responsa that Chacham Abdallah Somech that wrote to Jews around the world were very understanding, very modern, and trying to see the situation in the days that they were living. So we have a rich tradition that we really shouldn't not tell. And the only way we can get our kids enthusiastic is just to tell them stories, anecdotes, things that are wonderful. On Pesach, for instance, we do the Ashkenazi because that's what all our children and grandchildren know. But we do 1 or 2 or 3 Middle Eastern versions, Iraqi versions. And my son learned it, and we do it every year. And my husband is from Bulgaria, he's Fardi from Spain originally, Pardo. I once took Yoram Gaon's some Echad Mi Yodea and another one about the goat, Zabinaba and so on, in Ladino. I put it on a CD and sent it to all my guests and said, please learn it because we're going to do it in Ladino this year, So they're beautiful things. We need to learn from each other. We need not to think, oh my God, the Ashkenazim are taken over. There's nothing wrong with it as long as we preserve and we tell each other the traditions.
Okay. Anything else?
I don't think so, unless you want to ask me something.
I mean, we could go all day, but there's no
Very, very
Okay.
So this was, I think, the best.
Wow, it's 1:00.
one.
Yeah.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
You should definitely be lecturing and speaking on
I
behalf
do.
of JIMENA. Would you, if we arranged something
Okay.
for
Yeah,
you?
sure.
Yeah, go